Hi, today we're going to talk about the brain. So the brain is the center for intellect, emotions, behavior, and memory. There's different regions of the brain that specialize for different functions. We're going to explore how the brain is protected and nourished. What are the functions of the brain and what specific regions does it relate to? And how the spinal cord and cranial nerves connect to the brain to form the control center of the human body. So the adult brain consists of four major parts: the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. So looking at this image, first of all, let's get our bearings of what is anterior and what is posterior. So you see this here, that's the cerebellum. You'll know when you see the cerebellum, it's always located posteriorly. This region here is called the brainstem. This region here is the diencephalon, which includes the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And this large region on top is called the cerebrum. So if we break this down and do a brief description of each, these three structures here are called the brainstem, and that includes the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata connects directly to the spinal cord and is important for a lot of our vital functions, particularly the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. The pons connects the midbrain to the medulla oblongata, and an important function that is controlled here is the respiratory system. This here is called the mesencephalon, or the midbrain. It is an important region for processing our visual and auditory data. Then as we move on to the diencephalon, the largest part of the diencephalon is called the thalamus. The thalamus is considered a major relay station of our brain. Below that is the hypothalamus, which is a major regulator of our homeostatic functions in the brain. The top here is called the cerebrum, which is our thinking cap. It's processing thought, memory, personality. This is the posterior region of the brain, and that's called the cerebellum, which is controlling our somatic, controls our complex somatic motor patterns. So we'll start with the protective coverings of the brain. Most superficially is the cranium or the skull bones. Underneath that, we have the cranial meninges, which, similar to our spinal cord, has the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. Remember the mnemonic PAD? Where the pia mater is the deepest of the three meninges, and it's located right on top of the brain tissue. In between is the arachnoid mater, and then the most superficial layer is called the dura mater. So in the brain, it's different because the dura mater has two layers: an external periosteal layer and an internal meningeal layer. These layers fuse together except for areas around the dural sinuses. And the dural sinuses are veins that drains venous blood from the brain and dumps it into the internal jugular vein and eventually into the superior vena cava. Outside of the periosteal layer is what's called an epidural space. So this is a potential space that is located between this periosteal layer and the dura mater and the skull bones. The dura mater also is going to create folds that separates different compartments of our brain. They're called falx cerebri, which separates the two hemispheres of the right and left cerebrum. falx cerebelli separate the two regions of the cerebellum, and the tentorium cerebelli is a sheet of dura mater that separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. We'll get into the cerebral spinal fluid and blood-brain barrier, which also protect the brain in different ways. So the dura mater extensions that we talked about, there's 3 of them. The falx cerebri is this region here in light blue, and it separates the right hemisphere from the left hemisphere of the cerebrum. The falx cerebelli is located down here, and it's going to separate the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. And the tentorium cerebelli is located right here, and it separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. So this is a nice image of what we talked about. The green here is the dura mater, the pink is the arachnoid mater, and the red is the pia mater. So that's PAD, pia mater, arachnoid mater, and dura mater. So here the pia mater is bringing the arterial blood to the brain. You can see here, this is the cerebral cortex, or the gray matter, and this is the white matter. This is the brain. In between here is a region called the subarachnoid space. So the subarachnoid space is the region in between the pia mater and the arachnoid matter. And the green is the dura mater. You can see it's made up of the 2 layers, the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. And it separates around these venous sinuses. This one on top is called the superior sagittal sinus. The one thing I want you to note is these little pink mushroom-like structures. They're called arachnoid villi. The arachnoid villi are an important part of the cerebral spinal fluid circulation because it reabsorbs the cerebral spinal fluid and empties it into the superior sagittal sinus so it can enter and be recycled into the circulatory system. So you can see how the dura mater surround the venous sinuses, which are large veins, and they're draining the blood, the venous blood from the vein, as well as the cerebral spinal fluid, and delivering it into the internal jugular vein. You can see here in green, this is one of those folds, and this is the falx cerebri, which is separating the right and the left hemispheres from each other. So in this image, we could see the pia mater, which sticks to the surface of the brain, and it's a way for blood vessels to enter the brain tissue. This space is called the subarachnoid space. And just like in the spinal cord, what is in that subarachnoid space is cerebral spinal fluid. And then up here is the dura mater. You could see the space for the superior sagittal sinus. And then above here is a potential space called an epidural space outside the dura mater, and it's a potential space between the periosteal layer of the dura mater and the skull. So on this lateral image, we could see the dural folds. This one here in blue is called the falx cerebri. The region down in here is called the falx cerebelli, which separates the right and left cerebellum. And then the tentorium cerebelli right here separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. So the cerebral spinal fluid is another method of protecting the brain. This is a clear, colorless liquid that protects the brain and spinal cord against chemical and physical injuries. When we look at the brain itself, we'll notice that there's ventricles. What a ventricle is a hollow space within the brain. And within these ventricles is where we produce cerebral spinal fluid. There's a lateral ventricle, a third ventricle, and a fourth ventricle. Within these ventricles, there's a structure called the choroid plexus, which produces the cerebral spinal fluid in each of these ventricles. So if we're looking at a lateral view of the brain, this is anterior and this is posterior. These are the lateral ventricles. There's two of them, a right and a left. Within these lateral ventricles, there's a structure called the choroid plexus, and it produces cerebral spinal fluid. This fluid goes into the interventricular foramina, into the third ventricle. In the third ventricle, it's also producing cerebral spinal fluid. Inside, there's also the choroid plexus. It travels down this cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of the midbrain, and it goes into the fourth ventricle. From the fourth ventricle, again, there's more cerebral spinal fluid produced here. There's two doors where we're going to send all the cerebral spinal fluid. One is called the median aperture. So this is going to take the cerebral spinal fluid down the central canal inside the spinal cord. The other one, there's two lateral apertures, one to the right and one to the left, and that's pouring the cerebral spinal fluid into the subarachnoid space, which surrounds the brain, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the external region of the spinal cord. And on an anterior view here, it's nice because you could see the two lateral ventricles. It's a right and a left. The fluid is carried through the interventricular foramina into the third ventricle, down the aqueduct of the midbrain into the fourth ventricle. And nicely here, you could see the two lateral apertures taking that cerebral spinal fluid into the subarachnoid space, and a median aperture taking that cerebral spinal fluid into the central canal. So the choroid plexus is within these ventricles, and it's a specialized form of tissue that produces cerebral spinal fluid. So if we could see it in here, it's mostly these ependymal cells and capillaries that secrete cerebral spinal fluid within these ventricles. So if we're talking about the circulation of the cerebral spinal fluid, it's formed in that choroid plexus of the ventricles. It begins at lateral ventricles, and this flows through the interventricular foramina into the third ventricle. From the third ventricle, it's going to go through the aqueduct of the midbrain into the fourth ventricle. And from the fourth ventricle, it's going to go into the median aperture through the central canal of the spinal cord, or the lateral apertures, which is going to take the cerebral spinal fluid in that subarachnoid space around the brain. At the same time, we're having the production of the cerebral spinal fluid. We need a method for reabsorption so we don't get an excess amount of cerebral spinal fluid around our brain and central nervous system, which is called hydrocephalus. So the method of reabsorption is through these arachnoid villi, which are like finger-like extensions that project into the dural venous sinuses, especially the superior sagittal sinus. The functions of the cerebral spinal fluid is it's a shock absorber, also is a chemical protection and provides the optimal chemical environment for the production of action potentials, and also the circulation is the exchange of nutrients and waste elimination. So if we look here, we could see again the lateral ventricles, and the lateral ventricles are going to produce the cerebral spinal fluid within the arachnoid villi. Here is an image of the superior sagittal sinus, and these are the arachnoid villi that extend into it. So from the arachnoid villi, we're going to resorb excess cerebral spinal fluid to maintain a constant pressure of cerebral spinal fluid within the system itself. So as we said, it's going from the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle, into the fourth ventricle, and then either throughout the subarachnoid space or inside through the central canal. So this flow of production and reabsorption through the dural sinuses maintains that balance of cerebral spinal fluid circulating. So understand and know this for your exam. Within the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle, we produce cerebral spinal fluid. The path is going to go from this lateral ventricle through the interventricular foramina into the third ventricle, through the aqueduct, cerebral aqueduct, into the fourth ventricle, and then either into the subarachnoid space or into the central canal of the spinal cord. At the same time, the arachnoid villi within these dural sinuses is going to reabsorb any extra cerebral spinal fluid and bringing it back into the circulation. Another protective mechanism of the brain is called the blood-brain barrier. So it allows a semi-selectively permeable membrane around the brain capillaries that allows oxygen and glucose into the brain. It prevents harmful substances and pathogens from entering the brain. Proteins and antibiotics cannot cross this, so they have to enter the brain through a transport mechanism. Oxygen, carbon dioxide, anesthetic drugs, and alcohol can cross the blood-brain barrier very easily. That's why it's very easy to get intoxicated after a few drinks. So reviewing some of the circulation, blood flows into the brain via two vessels, the internal carotid artery and the vertebral arteries. The dural venous sinuses is it's the venous system that drains the veins of the brain into the internal jugular vein and eventually into the superior vena cava. So the blood-brain barrier is a very selective, selectively permeable barrier that separates the circulating blood from the extracellular fluid within the brain itself, or the brain endothelial cells. So you can see here, it's made up of these tight junctions of endothelial cells that do not allow that create that selectively permeable membrane. Also have very thick basement membrane. The capillaries have a very thick basement membranes. The other thing you could see here in tan are called astrocytes, which are a form of glia cells. Remember, we talked about the central nervous system glia cells, and these astrocytes surround the capillaries and also protect them by creating this blood-brain barrier around the capillaries of our brain. So let's start with the brainstem. The brainstem consists of three major regions: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The medulla oblongata is what connects directly to the spinal cord. And note that within the brainstem, it's associated with 10 of the 12 cranial nerves and controls a lot of our autonomic behaviors needed for survival. So if there was an injury to the brainstem, it could be detrimental to life. So the medulla oblongata connects directly to the spinal cord. It connects through the foramen magnum at the base of the occipital bone. So there are nuclei that are associated with the oblongata are associated with the sensations of feeling touch, proprioception, pressure, vibration. Within the medulla oblongata, there's a decussation of pyramids. Pyramids are tracks that are connecting the upper brain centers from the spinal cord, and decussation means that they cross over. So that explains why a brain injury on the right side of our brain will express itself on the left side of the body. Within the medulla oblongata, we have nuclei associated with 5 of the 12 cranial nerves. That includes 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. The 2 of the important functions that are regulated by the medulla oblongata are the cardiovascular system, which adjusts the force and rate of heart contractions and also blood vessels and control. And there's a respiratory center, which controls the rate and depth of breathing. Some important reflexes that are located in the medulla oblongata include sneezing, coughing, swallowing, and vomiting. So you can see this is the medulla oblongata, and the 5 cranial nerves nuclei that are located in the medulla oblongata include cranial nerve number 8, which is called the vestibulocochlear. And the vestibulocochlear controls the hearing, the sensory control for hearing and balance. And the hearing portion of the vestibulocochlear is located in the medulla oblongata. 9 is the glossopharyngeal. Glossopharyngeal controls swallowing and salivation. 10 is called the vagus nerve, which controls the motor aspect to the pharynx and larynx, and also sensory to the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity organs. 11 is accessory, which gives us the motor function, for example, to shrug our shoulders. And 12 is hypoglossal cranial nerve, which stimulates our tongue movements and allows us to speak. So here you can see the decussation of the pyramids as the information is coming in on this side. For example, on the left side is going to the right side of the brain and vice versa. You can see the nuclei for some of the cranial nerves we talked about. So again, with the medulla oblongata, it relays sensory input and motor output between the brain and the spinal cord. The important regions that are controlled here are cardiovascular and the respiratory center, the reflexes, the important vital reflexes that include vomiting, coughing, swallowing, and sneezing. The other nuclei that are listed here are association with the perception of sensation of touch, conscious proprioception, meaning, for example, if you have your eyes closed and you touch a comb, you know it's a comb. Pressure and vibratory sense. In this image here, here's the medulla oblongata right here. This is the spinal cord. You could see it's right in front of fourth ventricle, and here's the cerebellum. The next region is the pons. Here's the medulla oblongata. This is the pons. So the pons, the important function is it's going to relay impulses from one side of the cerebellum to the other, and also impulses between the medulla oblongata and the midbrain. Within the pons, along with the medulla oblongata, have a respiratory group that also control breathing. Within the pons, we have an additional amount of 4 cranial nerve nuclei that are located in the pons, which includes the trigeminal nerve, which is important for receiving sensation and of the face, and also motor functions for chewing. The abducens is cranial nerve number 6, which controls eyeball movement. Number 7 is the facial cranial nerve, which controls the muscles of facial expression, secretions of saliva and tears. And number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is responsible for balance and equilibrium, which is the portion that relates to balance and equilibrium. So we think of pons as the bridge that connects higher brain centers to the spinal cord. It's also relaying impulses within the cerebellum and contains the pontine respiratory nuclei, which together with the medulla oblongata control respiration. It's the control of respiratory functions. The next region is the midbrain. You can see it right here. So the important part about the midbrain, it's going to relay the motor output from the cerebellar cortex to the pons and the sensory input from the spinal cord and the thalamus. You can see this region here, it's called the tectum. It has these 4 little bumps. The 2 top is called the superior colliculi, which are responsible for visual reflex centers, and the lower 2 little bumps are called the inferior colliculi, which are responsible for the auditory relay centers. So the visual reflex center, for example, it's how you react if a ball is coming towards your face, you instantly will blink, versus the auditory reflex, if you're sitting in a room and you hear a loud noise, it's kind of instinctually to turn towards that area. Within the midbrain, there is a region called the substantia nigra, and this is a region that releases dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that goes to the basal ganglia of the brain, which controls our subconscious muscle activities. So a problem or a degenerative process either in the substantia nigra or the basal ganglia results in a condition called Parkinson's disease. Within the midbrain is also the red nuclei, which is important for coordinating our muscle activities. So within the midbrain, we have 2 additional cranial nerves, oculomotor, which is cranial nerve 3. Just like the word states, oculomotor controls eyeball movement, and trochlear, which is cranial nerve 4, which is another cranial nerve which controls the eyeball movements. So you could see here, you could see the substantia nigra and the red nuclei and the superior colliculi on top and the inferior colliculi. The reticular formation is a mass of nerve cells located primarily in the brainstem and somewhat into the diencephalon. These are neurons that are both ascending or sensory and descending motor. The important part of the reticular formation is important in controlling our consciousness and arousal. It controls certain autonomic functions related to posture, balance, and the sleep-wake cycle. So part of this reticular formation, the ascending portion of the reticular formation is called the reticular activating system. And what the reticular activating system is helps in maintaining our consciousness and is active during awakening from sleep. So part of this reticular formation in terms of maintaining our attention and alertness, for example, if you're sitting in a library and you're trying to study for this exam, but a neighbor on another table is talking on the phone, it's how you can focus in on what you're studying and almost block out what is around you. The reticular activating system is responsible for maintaining consciousness and waking us from sleep. Damping this reticular activating system can result in a coma. Melatonin, which is a common hormone often taken to help a person sleep at night, affects this reticular activating system by helping to induce sleep. And here is an overview of what we talked about. The medulla oblongata, important for the sensory input and motor output between different parts of the brain. The pons, the medulla oblongata regulates important vital functions related to cardiovascular and the respiratory system. The pons also regulates an important respiratory control center, and the midbrain has the superior and inferior colliculi controlling the auditory reflex and the visual reflexes. Note that their cranial nerves 2 through 12 nuclei are located in the brainstem. So if the test question asks you, are all 12 located in the brainstem, all 12 nuclei of the cranial nerves located in the brainstem, the answer is no. The cerebellum is located posteriorly and is important for regulating posture and balance. The diencephalon is made up of the hypothalamus and the thalamus. The thalamus is considered a major relay station. Hypothalamus controlling a lot of our autonomic functions. And the cerebrum is the thinking cap. And these we will talk about, cerebellum, diencephalon, and cerebrum, in our next video. We are done. Have a good day.